All right. So we are back. No. All right. So here we go. Back to fiscal policy. Okay. Now, next thing I want to add to this. Okay. And I'm going to set this up a little different than I did in your notes previously. Okay. But the expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. We're going to draw a little arrow. Okay. The side effect. Okay. Put it on the back or something. The side effect of our expansionary fiscal policy is going to be that we create a budget deficit. And we have to understand that this is an important part of fiscal policy. I call it a side effect because the government is not intending to do this. But when they're trying to fix the recession, okay, and they're spending more and taxing less, that's what's creating the budget deficit, okay? And so, I don't know why did I spell it? Whatever. Okay. Now, whenever we're asked about fiscal policy and interest rates, then this deficit is where we get that impact from. So the budget deficit, it means that the government, we're going to say it increases, government borrowing, which hopefully we know increases the demand on which graph? The loanable funds graph. Loanable funds market. So that's the next graph that we get to draw tonight, is the loanable funds graph. Make a big X. The demand and the supply of loanable funds. This is the quantity of money. Focus, people. And the real interest rate. Now remember, a couple things about loanable funds graph, okay? Upward sloping supply curve. And we are using the real interest rate in the loanable funds graph, okay? And it's always the graph that we use alongside fiscal policy because it's where the government has to go if they need to borrow money. And when our government has a deficit, a budget deficit, they need to borrow. That's our sign. So when they borrow, this is where they go, and that's going to increase the demand for borrowing. Yes, sir. This is, yes, this is what crowding out is all about. Okay? So we need to know that if you were ever asked about expansionary fiscal policy and how it changes interest rates go up because the government had to borrow more money. The loanable funds graph, and this, I'll be honest, in all the situations I've seen in AP exams where the loanable funds graph is used, this is how we use the loanable funds graph most often, is the government has to borrow money, and so we show an increase in demand of the loanable funds graph to show that the government's borrowing more because of whatever action that they are doing to fix a recession. Okay? Question about this. We'll come back to, Maddie, you were asking about the crowding out, or Nick. We'll come back to that concept again in just a minute. Okay? Questions? Expansionary fiscal policy. Anything? Yes, sir. All right. All right, moving on. Let's talk about contractionary fiscal policy. And we need to know that contractionary is used during inflation, and the goal is to control growth and inflation. Our tools are to decrease spending and increase taxes. Decrease spending and increase taxes. And we know then that that's going to cause a decrease in aggregate demand, which causes a decrease in GDP and also a decrease in inflation when we graph. That's what we're trying to slow down is inflation. We're pulling back on the reins, right? Right. Whoa. Yep. So let's draw quickly aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. Hopefully we're realizing that this is all the opposite of what we just put, right? So now we have an inflationary gap. Here is my L RAS. Ooh, I'm squishing it all in here. Sorry. S RAS and AD. We know this is the real GDP. And there's your inflationary gap. So that's what we're trying to fix. We've got an inflationary gap. We need to slow this baby down, right? Pull back on the reins. We do that by taxing more and spending less. And what do you know? The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, and we get our economy back to long-run equilibrium. We have now stabilized the economy. Now, real quick question. This goes back to last review session. We've got an inflationary gap, and the government doesn't do anything. Will the economy get back to long-run equilibrium? Yes. It will. It will self-correct. The SRAS is always a self-correcting curve. So that's the opposite of the government stepping in and using fiscal policy. Okay? So just like we did with the expansionary, we should know that the side effect is that we end up with either a smaller deficit or a budget surplus. Okay? So we'll say a budget surplus. And whenever we have a budget surplus, that means that we are going to decrease government borrowing. Which is going to decrease the demand in the loanable funds market. And we know that when we decrease the demand in the loanable funds market, the interest rate will fall. Do you need me to draw another loanable funds graph? All right. Loanable funds graph then. All right. We've got the quantity of money, demand and the supply, the real interest rate, and here's our equilibrium. Now, I think it's important, I didn't say this a minute ago, but I think it's important that we understand that in the loanable funds graph, this graph, okay, the supply curve represents the amount of savings in the economy, and the demand curve represents the amount of borrowing in the economy. And that's why when the government borrows more or less, we go here to this market. Okay? In this scenario, the government's going to borrow less because they have extra money. They don't need to borrow as much. So that would shift the demand curve left. And that's where we get that the interest rate is going to fall. Opposite of crowding out, opposite of when we have a budget deficit. Okay? So, if you think, what does a contractionary fiscal policy do? Well, it slows the economy down. It slows down inflation, right, by having the government spend less and tax more. But if you're asked about the how contractionary fiscal policy impacts interest rate, it causes interest rates to fall because the government doesn't need to borrow as much money. Okay? Questions on that? Anything fiscal policy related? All right, let's take a look at question 10. I'm on the 2013 exam. This is from last week. Question 10. Let's take a look. So question 10. This is a great example of a question about fiscal policy, and this should be easy peasy if we know what fiscal policy is all about. We need a fiscal policy action that is to reduce inflation. So we're trying to pull back on the reins, right? So our tools are spend less or tax more, and we look at the answers. Increase taxes and decrease spending. I believe B looks like a pretty good answer. Yes, Keegan. Yeah, and that's a great thing, and students will get hung up on that. Shh, listen, when we're talking about fiscal policy, the government can use both tools or one or the other. They don't have to do both. So that answer choice of raising taxes or cutting spending works because they don't need to do both tools. Just one will do the trick. Okay? Now, this is the questions I'm going over are the questions from last exam. Let's take one more question. Let's look at question 34. 34, again, this is on the old exam, not the one you picked up today. So let's look at this together. 34 says, following a decrease in exports. So exports falling just means that the GDP is falling, right? That's a part of our aggregate demand. So the GDP would be falling. So we want a fiscal policy that would restore or counter the decrease in exports. So that means we need an expansionary fiscal policy. Everybody follow me there? So we got to either cut taxes or spend more. And the answer choice that is best is going to be B. So an increase in government transfer programs is you are putting more money in the economy using things like welfare or Social Security or unemployment, things like that. Okay? It's the same thing as government spending. Now, why can D or E not be the right answer? That's monetary policy. So the people that made this test, they made that question not super easy, but they're helping you out, okay? Because all of a sudden your answer or your odds just got down to 1 out of 3 instead of 1 out of 5. Yes, sir. Why isn't it C? Because a reduction in the budget deficit, that happens when we're using a contractionary fiscal policy. Right? When does the deficit get smaller? When we are spending less and taxing more, right? So that doesn't restore the change that we get. Okay? So we need either more spending or we need lower taxes. Any other questions? All right, rolling on. Let's get to monetary policy. And let's start with expansionary monetary policy. Now, quick refresher. We just said fiscal policy was all about the government. Monetary policy is all about the Fed. The Federal Reserve is in charge of monetary policy. We need to make sure that we understand that. Okay? Now, I'm not going to write this all down, as we just did, but, oh, it's really small. Sorry. Expansionary policies, okay, are used at the same time, fiscal or monetary. So that means that the expansionary monetary policy is used during recession, and the goal is to boost GDP. Okay, used at the same time, same goal, process is different. So let's take a look at our tools. There are 3 monetary policy tools. And for expansionary, we want to decrease the required reserve ratio, decrease the discount rate, or buy bonds. If you were the Federal Reserve, do you need to use all 3 tools to create an expansionary policy? No, only one has to be used. They all can be used, but you only need to use one. Okay? Yes. Most often is buy and sell bonds. Okay? The other 2 tools are used really in more of an emergency situation, but for our questions, they kind of throw them all at us. Okay? Good question. All right. So what we need to know is that these 3 tools are all designed when we're using an expansionary monetary policy to increase the money supply. They are 3 ways to get the money supply to grow. Okay? Going back to last unit 4, what we're doing is we're increasing bank reserves. Okay? We are putting more money in. Really, we're increasing banks' excess reserves. So they have more money available to loan out, which then increases the money creation process. Okay? But we're increasing the money supply. Now, which graph do I use to illustrate this action? Money market graph. Money market, demand curve, downward sloping, vertical supply curve. And remember, loanable funds uses the real interest rate, and the money market uses the nominal interest rate. Quick refresher. We went over this last week, but I'll say it again. In the money market graph, the demand curve represents the amount of money that is demanded as cash only. The demand curve is all about how much money people want to hold as cash. The supply curve, which is a vertical line, always in this graph, represents the money supply. Okay? It's vertical because it is controlled by the Federal Reserve. Only the Federal Reserve can cause that curve to change. It's the money supply. Okay? That's why we use this graph. We talk about monetary policy. So expansionary monetary policy, we buy bonds, bigger bucks. The supply curve shifts to the right. More money, more money. And you see here that expansionary monetary policy causes a decrease in the interest rate. Questions so far? All right. Now, from there, decrease the interest rate. Okay? Moving over here. We got a lower interest rate in the economy. And what are we hoping happens? We want businesses to say, oh, look at those low interest rates. We want that money. It's cheap, right? We want the banks to the businesses to run to the banks and borrow. So we want an increase in business borrowing and spending. We want an increase in business BS, borrowing and spending. Ha, ha, ha. And that causes an increase in AD. Questions on that? So if I was graphing a recessionary gap, right? That's what we're trying to fix. We've got an economy that's operating below its potential. The Federal Reserve says, hey, we can fix this. Let's buy bonds. We buy bonds. We put more money in the economy, lower the interest rate. Businesses come running, right? They increase the borrowing and spending. Bada boom, bada bing. Aggregate demand increases, and we have restored our economy back to long-run equilibrium. Okay? Now, please, 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 make sure you look at your fiscal and monetary policies carefully. Make sure you understand that both policies have the same goal. They both want to increase aggregate demand, but the process for achieving the goal is different. Okay? Different process for achieving the goal. All right, moving on. Anybody have any questions over that at all? All right, let's look at contractionary monetary policy. And again, this is the Fed. Okay? What's the goal, or when do we use the contractionary policies? During inflationary times, right? Use contractionary policies during inflationary times, and the goal is to control growth and inflation. If we have an inflation problem, we need our stabilization policies are contractionary, okay? So we need to make sure we know our tools, and our tools are raise the required reserve ratio, raise the discount rate, and sell bonds. Now, I want to go through those tools real quick because I don't think I covered this last time. Remember, the required reserve ratio is the percentage of money that banks are required to hold on to. So when that percentage changes, that allows banks, or it's going to directly change the amount of excess reserves available. We, in this case, raise the rate, so banks are forced to hold on to more reserves by law, which means they have less excess reserves available anytime a deposit comes in. The discount rate, that is the rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks. So if you were a bank and you needed to borrow money, the Federal Reserve is a place that you can go to borrow. Okay? The discount rate is the rate you have to pay. So when that rate increases, a bank will be less likely to borrow from the Federal Reserve, therefore taking less money from the Fed and putting it into the economy. Okay? And then sell bonds. This is the process of directly changing excess reserves by the Federal Reserve, selling bonds. Banks buy those bonds, and the Federal Reserve takes their excess reserves away from them. Okay? Whenever we buy and sell bonds, the Fed is either selling and taking money out of excess reserves, or buying the bonds away and putting money into excess reserves. Okay? Buying and selling bonds directly impact the amount of money in excess reserves. Nick? We're trying to decrease the money supply. Yes. Decrease the inflation. Yes. No, that's right. All right, so back on board here. This is going to shrink the money supply. So it's going to change our money market graph. Nominal interest rate. That is the money supply right there that you're looking at. This is the quantity of moolah. And our contractionary policy shrinks the money supply. We are taking money away from banks so they have less money to loan out. And when that happens, the interest rates go up. And remember, We didn't mention this the other day, but the nominal interest rate is just a generic term that represents all interest rates in the economy. The federal funds rate is a specific interest rate that changes with the nominal rate. So in this scenario, we're taking money away, so banks have less money available, which means the federal funds rate will also increase because banks in this scenario have less money to loan each other. So the price then that you'd have to pay to get money is going to go up. Okay? So the impact of this interest rate going up, when we have an increase in interest rate, that means that there will be less business BS. Businesses don't want to borrow and spend when they got to pay more. And so that is going to lower the aggregate demand. And what do you know? We have controlled inflation problems. Questions over monetary policy? Let's take a look at question number 17 in your packet. All these are from the old. Question 17 from the old packet. We got an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. An increase in the money supply will affect the price level and real GDP in the short run in which of the following ways? You go right to your notes. We put more money in the economy. That is an expansionary monetary policy. So that's going to cause aggregate demand to go up. So both GDP and price level will go up. Answer would be increase. Let's go with D like a dog. Question, Sierra. Means that something's going on in the economy. Something fishy, yeah. I would just say, if they tell you, the best thing to know about aggregate supply is assume it's always upward sloping unless you're told it's not. And if they tell you it's not, just draw it how they tell you to draw it, and you'll be good. Well, the question might say that, I think there's one in this packet, but it might just say that, assume that the aggregate supply curve is horizontal. And then they'll give you a scenario. Just draw it horizontal and then solve the problem. Does that make sense? It's not going to ask you why is it horizontal. It's going to ask you if it's horizontal, what will happen. You should be able to answer that if you draw a graph with it horizontal and then solve it as normal. Okay? Good question. All right, moving on. Next is policy mix. Okay? Now, policy mix is all about combining fiscal and monetary policies. Okay? So we should know, and I'm not going to go through all these, but we should know that, if we use, let's say, expansionary fiscal policy along with expansionary monetary policy, okay, that using those two policies together is going to increase aggregate demand and all the things that go along with that. So increased price level, increased GDP, decreased unemployment. Okay? Those policies are designed to reinforce one another and help to fix a recession. What's the issue when you combine those two policies? The interest rates conflict each other, right? And so we need to know that, yes, they increase aggregate demand, but expansionary fiscal causes an increase in interest rates, while the expansionary monetary causes a decrease in interest rates. So because they conflict each other, we don't know what's going to happen with our interest rates. Okay, you like that? Like that button, right? So that's the issue when you combine these policies. Okay? Now, what I will say is that let's put here the best combo, good snack food. The best combo is nacho cheese and pretzel, okay? But the best combo here is, we'll say best combo for growth equals contractionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy, because they give you a low interest rate. Ding, 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 ding. Winner, winner. Why is that good for growth? Businesses will want to BS, right? Which means that we end up with more capital. More capital helps us have more growth. So if we want a combination that's going to promote growth, we need low interest rates. That's your winner. So the moral of the story here is that you have to understand that there are certain scenarios where the combinations go together and they reinforce one another. And there's also certain scenarios where they conflict. Okay? Like we would, let's take a look at question... Question one. Question one. Which of the following combinations of economic policies would be most effective to correct a severe recession? So we need to know, right? We got a recession. Are we concerned about growth here? No, we're concerned about fixing the recession. So in that scenario, I look at that, we need two expansionary policies, okay? Which means we need to lower taxes, and we need to increase the money supply. So D like a dog is going to be your answer. That makes sense. That question wants to fix the recession, so expansionary gives us the result that we need. Now let's take a look at question 31. Which of the following combinations could reduce a government deficit without changing aggregate demand? So, what policy is best for reducing the government deficit? It's got to be a fiscal policy, because that's the government. So it's got to be contractionary fiscal policy. Now, let's just quickly explain why this is. Contractionary fiscal policy, and I'll jot it on the board, means that we are decreasing government spending and raising taxes. So if you were creating a budget with that happening, it will be easier for you to create that budget, right? Because you're bringing in more money and spending less. That will allow you to reduce the deficit. Okay? And if we don't want to change aggregate demand, what kind of monetary policy do we need? We need expansionary monetary policy. So they conflict each other in terms of changing aggregate demand, but the contractionary fiscal reduces the deficit. So the best answer would be B, like Bob. Raise taxes and increase the money supply. Questions on that? I think, personally, some of the questions about combining the policies can be the hardest questions, because you have to kind of sort through a couple things depending on what you're being asked. We good? All right, roll on. Let's get down to number 4. This one's going to be fairly quick. We are talking about crowding out. Now, we started explaining this. What we need to know is that crowding out is initiated with expansionary fiscal policy. crowding out is initiated with expansionary fiscal policy because, as we said before, when we use this, we have a budget deficit, and the government has to borrow. Okay? So if you went back to your notes about expansionary fiscal policy, you see that we started to talk about a side effect, right? This is the side effect. That when we do this, we have a deficit, the government has to borrow, and we use the loanable funds graph to show that the interest rate will increase in the loanable funds market. So the key is knowing that an expansionary fiscal policy initiates this crowding out process because it causes interest rates to go up, and businesses don't want to borrow and spend. We have less business BS, less business borrowing and spending, and that means that we have less capital, which lowers our growth. That's important for us to know. Less capital, less growth. When we have high interest rates, that will always slow down our long-run growth because we aren't going to be spending as much money on new capital equipment. And again, long-run growth is or happens when we have more land, labor, capital. So if we have less capital, that's going to slow the growth down in our economy. Okay? Take a look at question 15. There's pretty much one question on crowding out every year. Question 15 is the winner. Question 15 says, crowding out is most likely to occur with which of the following changes? And, oh, what do you know? C, like a cat, increase in budget deficit. Okay? Questions? C. We're all good? All right, we're moving on. Let's take a look at the last thing, promoting or policies that promote growth. To get growth, short, super short. We need an increase in land, labor, and capital. Land, labor, and capital is how we get growth. Now, policies, anything that's directed at increasing human capital can do that. We don't see this a ton, but every once in a while you see things that talk about human capital. Just know human capital is what's in your brain. Okay? The more stuff you got in your brain, somebody thinks that you're going to be a better worker, and so you're going to be more productive, and we can have more growth. Okay? The other way is if we want more capital, the best way to get more capital is to get businesses to spend more, which means we need, like we said earlier, low interest rates. Low interest rates, businesses say, give me that money, right? They want to go to the bank and borrow, and when they spend, they're spending on new machines, new equipment, new technology, new factories, and all those things help for our economy be more productive. Questions? All right, flip it. Here we go. Types of inflation. This in your notes actually is in Unit 2, but I'm going to be super fast. Okay? Demand pull. Is that small? Oh, sorry. Erase. Let's try it again. Demand pull. That's a little better. So demand pull is or happens when there is an increase in aggregate demand. That's it. Something that causes an increase in aggregate demand causes demand pull inflation. Because when you increase aggregate demand, you end up with an increase in price level. That's the inflation that we are referring to. Okay? Piece of cake. Next, cost push. Cost push inflation happens when there is a decrease in the SRAS. Or, what else can change? A right shift. Way to go, Darius. A right shift of the SRPC. So let's just quickly graph the short. We're going to graph first. This is AD SRAS. AD SRAS. When this curve shifts to the left, we end up with an increase in price level. Okay? That's the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. That's cost push inflation. Okay? On the Phillips curve, we'll draw this better in a minute. SRPC. This is unemployment. This is inflation. If this curve shifts to the right, we move from, we'll call it point A to point B. Oh, bad B. And there you go. We have an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment. So both ways show cost push inflation, which is also known as stagflation, cost push inflation, same theme, Bob. Okay, Olivia? Yep. Stagflation equals an increase in price level with an increase in unemployment. So double whammy bad, okay? So if you look at your Phillips curve, it's a great indicator, right? You move from A to B. Both inflation and unemployment are increasing. That is stagflation. What causes stagflation is an increase in resource prices. When the price of oil goes up, okay, businesses have to pay more for the resource, and so they cut back on production. They lay people off. Our pets' heads fall off. All kinds of bad stuff happens then, okay? All right. Next cause of inflation is the quantity theory of money. Quantity theory of money, okay? This concept is when we have an increase in the money supply, we end up with an increase in price level. That's it. More money, higher prices. Now remember, an increase in price level, an increase in inflation, that's the same thing. Okay? The same thing. Question. You're shooting guns at me, Caleb Varney. All right. What's that? I did. I know. That is documented. That's right. All right. All right, here we go. Phillips curve, another graph that's on your graph sheet. The Phillips curve. For some reason, people are yelling at Grace Heemstra. Why are we yelling at Grace? Oh, because she's not here. All right. Now, Phillips curve is where everybody put their game face on for 15 minutes. We compare inflation and unemployment. Our short-run Phillips curve. It looks like a demand curve, but it's not. It's a short-run Phillips curve. Now, remember, the short-run Phillips curve shows us the trade-off in the short run between inflation and unemployment. Trade-off means that if we lower inflation, we end up with more unemployment. If we lower unemployment, we end up with more inflation. Okay? And I will tell you this, that I think a good thing to know about the Phillips curve is the Phillips curve always corresponds with an aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. It just shows us what's happening with inflation and unemployment specifically within that economy. Okay? So whenever there's a change in the AD-SRAS graph, it will also change the Phillips curve. And that's how we remember our determinants, right? Anytime there's a change in AD, we move along in the opposite direction. So if AD, you can put a little example here. If AD increases, that means we're shifting AD to the right. So then we would move along to the left. To the left, to the left. We'd move it along to the left. There was a song about that, I think. About the Phillips curve. You just didn't know it. All right. Next, when we have a change in SRAS, change in SRAS means that we shift entire SRPC in the opposite direction. And the graph right above us, right, the cost push, that's a perfect example of that. The SRAS shifts left, you move the SRPC to the right. The long run Phillips curve, okay, is a vertical line. LRPC. And what that represents is the inflation rate in the economy in the long run. Okay, it can be whatever it wants, but in the long run, our unemployment rate will always be at what we call the natural rate of unemployment, which is between 4 to 6%. So our economy will always be within that 4 to 6% unemployment range in the long run, regardless of inflation. Okay? So what we should know is when our economy is operating at point A, that represents long-run equilibrium because our inflation rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Sure. We would also have no GDP. Right. Now, if we have high inflation, we'll call that point B, high inflation and less than normal unemployment, point B represents an inflationary gap. So A, we are at long run. My inner rapper was coming out of me there. So A, we're at long run. B, we have an inflationary gap. And C is a recessionary gap. And like that. Got it. Not done yet, people. Almost. You know what? Let's take a look at question 32. 32 is a Phillips curve question. Oh, that's a slam dunker. A slam dunker. Take a look. 32. You probably should hope and wish that that question's on the exam. Okay. All right. One thing that while we're there, we missed this one, but let's take a look at question 30. Question 30. Which of the following is most likely to be caused by an adverse supply shock? Adverse means that the supply curve is shifting to the left, and when that happens, we call that either stagflation or cost push inflation. Either would be the correct answer. Questions? If only they would allow us to take the exam together as a group. We dominate it. All right. Last scenario on the let's take a look at might do this backwards. Can't read my writing. Oh, let's take a look at question 30. 37. Take a look at 37, and then we'll look at the concept. That's a doozy. All right, let's take a look at this question, and then we'll talk about the idea here. So, an increase in inflation expectations just means that inflation is going to happen. Okay, we are fully expecting or anticipating inflation to happen. Now, if you were a banker, and I told you that inflation was going to happen, okay, you would prepare for inflation by adjusting your interest rates, which is the nominal interest rate. Okay? So just remember this. Okay? When we know inflation is going to happen, then we always say, well, the effect is minimal, right? Because we have a chance to prepare. So banks can prepare by changing their nominal rate in preparation for inflation. So that means then the nominal interest rate would go up. If we knew inflation was going to happen, we would raise the nominal rate in preparation. Okay? Because, real quick, if you were a bank and you didn't raise your nominal rate, what would happen? Would you be hurt or would you be helped by that? You'd be hurt, right? Because a lender always loses. So this is your chance, banker, to not lose, so you raise your rate in preparation for the inflation. Okay? So you raise the interest rates. Now, here's what we have to understand. And you all have this in your notes somewhere, but it's a concept that gets talked about not a lot. Interest rates and bond prices are always opposite. Whenever you are asked about bond prices, okay, you've got to figure out what's happening to interest rates and just know they're always opposite to one another. So then that makes this pretty easy to solve in the end because you know interest rates go up, so bond prices must fall. Okay? If you were given a question that just asks you what's going to happen to or what would cause a country's bond prices to rise, then you need to find the scenario that would cause the interest rate to fall. Okay? They're always opposite one another. So what we need to add about inflation expectations. One, we need to know that it's when inflation is fully anticipated. And when we have fully anticipated inflation, we end up with an increase in price level. But because we were able to prepare for that inflation, an increase in price level with no change in output. So our GDP is not impacted in any way because we've been able to prepare for the inflation, which would also mean then that you have no change in unemployment. GDP, unemployment are not going to change. We only end up with an increase in price level. And you can see on your outline, inflationary expectations are also known as the theory of rational expectations. It's the same thing, okay? And it all happens when inflation is fully anticipated, okay? Last question, 54. 54, I think, covers the same concept. It doesn't. I don't know why I put this with this one. Which of the following would cause a movement along? So this really goes to the Phillips curve. I just wrote it down in the wrong spot. So if you're looking at your Phillips curve, right, and it says that we have a movement along the Phillips curve toward higher unemployment and lower inflation. It'd be like moving from A to C. So that would mean then that would be synonymous with that's moving to the right, so a leftward shift or a decrease in AD is what we're looking for. Okay? So we got to figure out the answer choice that would cause AD to fall. Best answer looks like B. Remember, when our trading partners, when their economies are doing poorly, that's going to directly impact us. They buy less from us, right? Causing our aggregate demand to fall.